Guards shoved Jonas Capel forward along the wet stone as Antoine Marek turned a heavy brass key and the cell door ground inward. Fear moved through Jonas in the rhythm of his steps. Breath held, knees tight, palms damp on the patched tunic. The corridor smelled of iron and candle smoke. Marek's keys rang like a verdict, quill scratched in the dark. Lucien Voss marking time, noting pulse, and the first real fact of the evening seated itself between concrete and bone. Silence would be enforced as punishment. Jonas had not yet been processed when the warder stopped and stripped him of a folded scrap of cloth that had been a soft thing against his chest. He reached for it with a stuttering hand. "Jonas," the warder said, naming him as if the name were a package to be opened and catalogued. Jonas pressed his palm to the rough cloth, then let go. He tried to speak once, and the sound stuck in his throat like swallowed metal. That trapped sound became the immediate problem. How to keep a man present without allowing him any reply. The narrator places this problem plainly: a prison that built obedience by removing the very act that binds people. Here, fear drove Jonas's first choices. He clutched at memory and at the tiny habit of counting breaths. He attempted no resistance that night, because resistance would invite the program's precise escalation. In the first hours he learned the rules by the absence of answers rather than the presence of blows. They pushed him into the cell. Marek's coat brushed Jonas's shoulder. The door's iron latch scraped against stone and closed. Marek clicked 3 keys in succession, each key finding its place. Jonas reached for the lock with the hollow gesture of someone who wanted to test whether the world still answered. Marek's hand stopped him. "Not yet, Marek." The word carried no urgency, only administration. Voss added the time to his ledger and tapped the quill across a margin. That cold beginning set up everything that followed. The warden, the physician, the inmate, each played an assigned role. The book of rules had been written in ledger ink long before Jonas arrived. The first shift in Jonas's feeling came when a warder took his only comfort. A hand-stitched patch with red thread. He handed it over without protest. The second shift arrived when Jonas tried a small noise and was met by measured indifference rather than explanation. Both shifts altered his behavior. He moved from raw fear into cautious calculation. The next paragraph opens into the cell's interior. The cell was narrow enough that a man could feel each wall sway with a sweep of his forearm. A stub candle sat in a metal dish bolted to the wall. Jonas had 2 blankets and a small wooden spoon. He pressed the spoon flat against his palm, counting, measuring time by the metal's coolness. The warder left. Marek paced the block. Voss leaned at the doorway and peered in with his round spectacles. "Why silence?" Voss, without looking up from his ledger. "Order, Marek, control." Identity yields to order. They spoke as if they discussed a machine. Their voices were low, exact. Voss noted the rise and fall of Jonas' measured breath. Marek touched the brass keyring at his hip and tapped it against his palm like a metronome. Jonas tried a sound on the first night. He cleared his throat once, tiny and involuntary. A warder in the corridor paused, then made a light knock at Jonas' door. That knock had the same legal weight as a sentence. A man learned quickly which noises would be answered and which would be met with silence. The wardens taught the distinction without whipping or threat. They taught it through the absolute refusal to reply. The next morning, Voss conducted an examination. He took Jonas' pulse, lifted his eyelids, and recorded notes in shorthand. He drew a clean, clinical line across the page labeled "Response" and left it intentionally blank. Voss's method was to convert human reaction into data. His questions were precise. Jonas tried to answer with his eyes and with a trimmer in his fingers. Voss lifted a pen and wrote. Slowed speech, vacant gaze. Marek stood behind him and corrected the ledger entry with a thin line. "This is efficiency, Marek." There follows a short confrontation in Marek's office where policy becomes explicit. Marek spread a list of names, each followed by a time and a method. He spoke slowly and used official words. If speech breaks resistance, remove speech. If answering creates disorder, answer will not be given. The body must remain. The voice must not. Voss did not dispute the language. He catalogued, adjusted, and explained outcomes in terms of control and measurable change. Jonas sat in the hall outside the office, hearing the words as if they were instruments falling into place. Marek and Voss argue about ends and means in three terse exchanges. Marek says, "We keep order." "That's our duty," Voss replies. "Observation informs duty." Marek presses, "Observation is not consolation." Voss answers, "Consolation skews results." The back and forth is quick and deliberate. Each man remains in his role, Marek the administrator, Voss the recorder. Their exchange makes the method intentional. Jonas' attempts to maintain presence take shape through small acts. He traces the numbers of his mother's cottage on the wall with a fingernail. He counts the rounds of the watch. He memorizes the scratch marks on the beam above his bed. Those acts are not introspective reveries. They are tactical attempts to hold a personhood that could be measured if someone later asked for it. Each act is physical, concrete. A finger tracing a grain in the wood, a throat full of air restrained. An external event interrupts this steady erosion. A tapping from the adjacent cell. Jonas feels it first as vibration along the shared stone. He presses his palm flat and taps 3 times, a number he knows his neighbor understands. A new emotion enters, cautious hope. The tapping trades a detail for a detail. Jonas' voice has been removed, but his hands can still speak. The tapping exchange is slow and careful. Jonas replies with the cross he has stitched. The neighbor sends back a short, clipped sequence of raps that say, "Name. Are you alive?" Jonas scratches a line. Jonas' a hand appears at the adjacent slit and curls in the dark. For a moment, the correspondence offers the concrete proof Jonas still exists. A warder notices the pattern. The tapping stops, the guard's footsteps quicken. He reports to Marek. That report is the chapter's mid-build external event. Marek's response is immediate. He orders Jonas moved. The shift here is sharp. Hope, a fragile, physical thing traded through stone, is cut down by procedure. The narrative does not linger on sentimental loss. It focuses on the direct consequence. Jonas will be placed in the deeper chamber. The transfer sequence is described through actions and dialogue. A warder grips Jonas' arm. "Jonas, come," the warder says. Jonas grips the patch that remains on his tunic and resists only enough to be human. "Antoine," Voss calls softly as the door swings. "Document fully." "Note time of transfer," Marek replies. Documented, the exchange contains 3 short lines. It moves the plot outward. Jonas is being escalated. They move him to the deep chamber at dawn. The door is thicker. There is no window. The candle stub is removed and set aside. Marek gives an instruction that becomes the chapter's apex. Do not answer him. Do not answer his voice or his eyes. The instructions are literal and procedural. Voss positions himself at a small table and opens his ledger. He leans forward with his spectacles low and writes notes by hand as the room's light fades. The climax itself is a sequence of concrete acts and refusals. Jonas speaks once, a raw, wet sound. A warder steps toward him. Marek raises a single hand and sets that warder back with the flat of his palm. "Do not answer," Marek says again. The warder meets Marek's face and obeys. Voss writes. Attempted vocalization, response withheld. Jonas' throat works. His hands claw at the mattress. The wardens and the physician do not respond with violence. They respond by leaving him unassisted, by refusing the human reply. That refusal becomes the method's most efficient instrument. Inside the room, Jonas' breathing becomes a visible action. He holds breath, then exhales in short bursts. He presses his forehead to the cold stone, because a physical contact gives a fact to the world. The body remains. He makes a small mark on the wall with the tip of his spoon, 3 scratches that mean, "I am here." He eats slowly, counts spoonfuls, pinches the candle fat between fingers to smell it and remember a day when his father's shop had been lit by lamp oil. Those are exact, concrete attempts to anchor identity. Voss stands and writes a series of measurements: response time, ocular fixation, heartbeat. He uses language of numbers. Marek writes 1 word in the margin: success. The physician's ledger entry is the chapter's formal closure of the experiment. The men treat collapse as proof. Jonas sits in the cell, eyes open and empty, and the ledger records his reduction to a line on a page. But the ledger contains a human error. While copying a day's observations into a bound volume, Voss notices older entries that show patterns of repeat destruction. He pauses, spreads the pages, and the pause becomes a small fracture. He tucks a folded scrap of paper between the ledger pages and later slips it toward Jonas' door during a walk by. The act is secretive and quick. Voss slides the paper into a groove in the stone. The scrap contains a single sentence. "Do not let them call this science. L." Jonas finds the scrap with a fingertip. His hope shifts again from cautious to combustible. He reads the handwriting, feeling the cool ink depress the paper beneath his nail. The scrap's existence changes the listener's understanding. The architects are not anonymous. Voss, recorded as the method's observer, harbors doubt. That revelation is the chapter's twist. The program's human authors disagree. The new information forces Jonas to a decision. He will no longer count in silence alone. He will attempt contact again, this time less with sound and more with marks. Outside, Marek walks the corridor. He flips the heavy keys on his ring and listens to the way they clink like punctuation. He is satisfied by the visible order. Prisoners reduced, ledgers full. He does not notice the small scrap. He does not hear the single new mark Jonas carves into the sill. His confidence remains functional and absolute. Voss, meanwhile, returns to his alcove and presses knuckles to his mouth. He touches the ledger as if it were a wound. The chapter closes with one final concrete event. Marek crosses the corridor, keys at his side, and stops at Jonas' cell. He glances in. Jonas sits pale and rigid. He raises his hand and traces 3 lines on the wall. Marek's hand goes to his keys, fingers tightening. He turns and walks away. Voss lingers and slips a second scrap of paper into the crack beneath the door. Jonas palms it and reads, "Remember your name." L. Voss, his mouth does not move. He folds the scrap and hides it beneath his mattress. The immediate conflict in this chapter resolves. The wardens escalate Jonas to the deeper chamber. Voss records the collapse's data, and Voss' hidden descent plants a seed of subversion. The enforcement of silence produced the result the institution sought. It also exposed a crack. The chapter ends not with grand reflection but with action. Marek closes the heavy door with a precise, administrative click, and Voss walks away with ink on his fingers. Jonas, mute, pins the scrap under a rough board and presses his palm over it until the beating in his wrist replaces the absence of sound. Emotionally, the chapter moved from fear to hope to despair and into a small, trembling possibility. Those shifts were shown through gestures. The grip on a patch, the tapping through stone, the hidden scrap slid through a crack. The narrator leaves listeners with a final physical beat. The lock finds its bolt and the corridors echo answers with keys. No broad moral closure is offered. Instead, the concluding fact remains concrete and audible. A door locked, a ledger marked, a man in a cell who still writes his name on the wall. A brass key turned and the observation hatch grated open before Jonas Kappel could steady his hands. Fear tightened his throat. He flattened his palms on his patched tunic and let his eyes follow the thin shaft of light toward the slit. Jonas, hold the slate upright. Antoine Marek threw the hatch in a voice that offered no mercy. The guard's boots struck the corridor stone like a metronome. Within those first moments, the central problem was clear. Enforced muteness would be measured tonight, and any slip could change how he lived, or whether he lived. Jonas had learned to count time by breathing. He inhaled twice and pressed the slate against the cell wall, the wood scraping under his fingers. He remembered the corridor from 2 nights earlier when guards had shoved him along wet stone and Marek's keys had sung like a verdict. That memory sat concrete in his chest as a line of fact, not a vaporous recollection. Fear drove his hands to act. He kept his mouth sealed because he had been ordered, and because speaking now would be more dangerous than the silence itself. The narrator stays with Jonas. He is 28 thin and keeps his gaze on small movements in the cell. The first 5 minutes of this scene establish the rules. Marek will demand visible compliance. Dröter Lucien Voss will record increments. The guards will watch for any attempt at speech or coded motion. Jonas' immediate problem is physical and precise. Complete the visible task under observation without breaking the silence. The stakes are public order, Marek's reputation for control, and Jonas' fragile hold on identity. A slate and a stub of candle rested on the threshold. Voss slid the slate through with a practiced hand and held a quill while his eyes adjusted the candle's S-flare. Write the day, Voss, without raising his voice. No sound. His tone held curiosity, not cruelty, but curiosity here narrowed into procedure. Jonas wrote 24th with a cramped hand. He did not speak. A guard tapped the slate to test its angle. The tap sent a line of cold down Jonas's spine. The room smelled of wet stone and melting wax. Voss watched the handwriting and made a line in his ledger. He paused twice, then asked for the weekday, Monday. Jonas's mouth silently and immediately froze, though the mouth had moved only enough for Voss's eye to catch the shape. A guard barked and Merrick's hand appeared, fingers closing on a brass key, so hard the metal clicking filled the cell like judgment. Merrick, Voss, he wrote Monday. Voss' handwriting slid into the margin. Small, neat, clinical. Merrick's eyes narrowed. We must tighten the silence protocol. Merrick, no mouthing, no gestures. His voice left no room for negotiation. In the corridor, one guard stepped forward and leaned his weight on the door. The presence of two named secondary characters, Antoine Merrick and Dra. Lucian Voss frames authority and observation against Jonas in forced stillness. Jonas pressed his palms together and breathed through the pattern he had practiced in the yard. He thought of the red thread patch stitched by a nameless hand and hidden under his tunic. He had used that patch once before to mark a date. That mark had kept him tethered to a past that the cell tried to strip away. Now, the patch itself risked being read as evidence of resistance. They moved him from the hatch to the corridor for a brief inspection. Merrick walked ahead with the brass keys at his hip. He stopped, turned, and said, "What is your labor?" The question was a measured test. Jonas bowed his head and tapped the slate against his palm to indicate the day labor. Voss wrote the response. A guard laughed under his breath, and the sound landed on Jonas like a small stone. Back in the cell, the experiment began in earnest. Voss installed a ritual of measurements. A candle placed on a specific stone shelf, a slate balanced at a precise angle. A series of timed knocks on the door that Jonas had to answer by shifting his weight only. The procedure read like a ledger. Each movement had to be visible and recorded. The warden observed from the corridor that distance mattered. Merrick's authority was a physical thing that sat between Jonas and the rest of the world. The first emotion shift happens here. Jonas moves from fear to a thin resolve. Fear makes him follow rules, but resolve makes him find ways to keep a private record. He racks his mind for a simple mark he can make on the cell interior that 1T be spotted during cursory checks. He sits and, with a nail hidden in the hem of his tunic, scores a shallow line behind a dislodged stone by the pallet. He hides the motion in the pattern of sweeping his sleeve. This act reframes his silence. Not mere obedience, but deliberate, quiet resistance. Dra. Lucian Voss notices faint scratches the next evening during a routine sweep. He leans close, adjusts his spectacles, and touches the marks with ink-stained fingertips. He asks Jonas to lift his sleeve. Jonas complies with a slow, measured movement. Voss reads the scratches as a sequence of dates and little crosses. Jonas' private ledger. His reaction is not loud. It is a precise intake of breath and a steadying of the hand on the quill. Jonas, Voss says, explain these marks. The clinical tone masks something like wonder. The second emotion shift runs through Voss at this moment. His empiricist detachment skews toward uneasy empathy. He records the marks. He copies them into his own ledger in shorthand. The act is small but dangerous. It complicates his role and ties him to Jonas. Jonas watches him, noting the tilt of his head when he writes. That tilt becomes, for the inmate, a kind of punctuation, proof that someone notices, and that someone might respond. Merrick returns that night and sees the copied notes on Voss's table. His face tightens. Lucian, what is this? He asks. The exchange that follows becomes the first rapid confrontation in the chapter. Antoine, Voss answers, these are the inmate's S-marks. He measures his days. He keeps the cross, you condone this. Merrick says, I did not condone. I observed. Observation is not sympathy. Lucian, are you accusing me of sympathy? The back and forth is clipped and direct. Each name appears with each line so the listener can track who speaks. The argument ends with Marek slapping a hand down and ordering the removal of the patch and increased isolation. The stakes rise. Marek treats the marks as contagion. An external event occurs. Guards remove Jonas's patch at Marek's command. They force him to stand while one guard peels the hand, stitched cross from beneath his tunic. Jonas feels the cloth tear against his skin, the faint warmth of the old stitching separating from the body. He presses his palms together to hide the tremor. The act is concrete and physical. It alters Jonas' interior anchor. Removing the patch severs a small but vital tie to his previous identity. After the removal, Marek orders a longer period of silent watches. Jonas is left with only a candle, a slate, and a ration of bread. Voss argues quietly and then more insistently, for limits and Toyn, extended darkness will break him. Voss says, "You will not gather useful data if the subject collapses." Marek answers, "He either learns or he breaks." The institution cannot be measured by sentiment. The argument continues with 3 rapid exchanges. Marek's vocabulary is short, militaristic. Voss' replies are precise, full of measured medical terms. The fight shows how 2 men who appear similar-aged, pale, committed to order, speak different languages. Marek speaks law and control. Voss speaks observation and thresholds. Voss returns to Jonas later, under the pretense of routine checks, and performs a clandestine act. He traces the shallow scratches with his quill and copies the sequence into his ledger. He does this with the ledger tucked beneath a stained waistcoat and a trembling hand. Jonas watches the movement of the quill and receives a small sign from Voss, the tilt of the head that earlier meant attention. Jonas' hope, fragile as it is, grows by measure. The narrative must keep moving. An external event, the guard who had been eyeing Voss's ledger, finds a loose note and delivers it to Marek at dawn. Marek reads the copied marks and interprets Voss's actions as insubordination. He summons Voss and confronts him in the warden's office. "Lucien," Marek says, voice cold, "why do you keep this?" "Antoine, the records. They matter to the study. Your records matter to you, not to the prison. You for evidence." Voss replies, "This is evidence of a mind trying to anchor itself." The exchange escalates. There are 6 quick lines as Marek presses for recantation and Voss refuses to hand over the copied pages. Marek threatens the loss of Voss's position. Voss replies by narrowing his eyes and saying, "Then take the ledger, take the notes. But mark what you take." The argument reveals that Voss chooses to place records where they cannot easily be destroyed. This leads straight into the chapter's climax. Marek orders a full blackout. The candle is snuffed. The latch is thrown. Jonas is plunged into absolute sensory deprivation while Voss watches through a narrow hatch, unable to intervene. The darkness does not act symbolically. It acts physically. Candlelight cut, breath swallowed, slate gone, the cell door bolted. Jonas braces against the pallet and counts his breaths. He feels the cold ring of the latch and hears the door's iron groan. That iron groan is the peak. The warden pronounces silence as a final sentence. Inside the cell, Jonas's body reacts. His hands shake. He huddles into himself and presses his forehead to the stone. He begins to tap the cell wall with his knuckles in a coded rhythm to mark time. The sound is small but precise. The tapping is a direct action that shows emotion through movement rather than naming it. Voss records the blackout in shorthand from the hatch. He writes the time of extinguishment, the length of the watch, and the immediate physical reactions. Rapid breathing, then a long flatness in the chest. He watches Jonas go from measured breathing to ragged gasps to a soft, deliberate stillness. Voss' hands do not tremble until he copies the final line. For the man who values observation, the act of writing what the silence produces becomes a moral fracture. Data recorded from a human being undergoing damage. Mid-chapter cliffhanger. During the blackout, a faint scraping is heard. Jonas has found a loose flake of mortar and is trying to pry it free. The sound carries to the hatch. The guard curses and pulls the candle back for a second. Everyone leans into that moment. Is Jonas attempting to escape, to write, to communicate? The guard's step, Marek's shadow, quick command. These details break the tension so the audience must wonder what the scratching will reveal. The scratching is cut off by Marek's order. The guard strikes the cell wall with the butt of a club to silence the noise. Jonas cries out without sound. His lips form words that no one will bear. Voss puts his hand over the pen for a long instant and then writes the incident as attempted disturbance, repressed. His clinical phrasing masks the knowledge that the scratches were likely a new code Jonas had devised. Mourning follows with a bureaucratic coldness. Voss annotates Jonas' reactions in the ledger. Marek declares the method effective. Jonas is led out, hollow-eyed and faded, and handed over for a medical inspection. The inspection records tremors in his limbs, faint pressure sores, and a measured loss of weight. Voss notes the signs. Marek records compliance. The two men catalogue the same body and arrive at different moral conclusions. Voss' response is decisive. He hides a copied page of Jonas' marks inside his ledger and slips a small brass key into a pocket beneath his waistcoat. The act is concrete. His fingers push the paper between pages. He feels the metal of the key press against his palm, and he seals the ledger with a tight knot of string. He does not make a speech. He performs an action that will influence what happens next. The final beat of the chapter is Voss putting the ledger away and locking his desk drawer. He pauses, looks at Marek across the room, and says nothing. The chapter ends with a set piece. Marek calls the watch successful and turns away, satisfied. Voss closes the ledger drawer with a soft thud and tucks the brass key into his waistcoat. Jonas returns to his cell, the lightless air pressing in on him. The last line finds Voss slipping the small key into his pocket while the sound of the corridor steps fades. The action is concrete and situational. A hidden promise of preservation and exposure now lives on a page and a key. The ledger and the key change the direction of the story. Throughout the chapter, dialogue drives conflict. Marek commands with short, clipped orders. Voss replies with clinical phrasing. Jonas rarely speaks, but his gestures and tiny acts, marking dates, hiding a cross, tapping the wall, supply the emotional texture the silence forbids him to voice. The primary emotion root here is fear, which shifts into resolve and then into a fragile alliance between observer and observed. Those shifts appear in actions. The mouth that moves, the hand that scratches, the quill that copies, the key that slips into a pocket. At the close, the immediate conflict of the chapter resolves. Marek's protocol is enforced. Jonas survives the blackout but is changed. Voss has risked his position to preserve an evidentiary trace. There remains a clear avenue forward. A ledger hidden, a key held. The consequences are concrete and will affect decisions in the next episode. The chapter leaves the listener with the image of a ledger closed and a key warm in a pocket, a promise grounded in a physical object rather than a summary or declaration. By the end of this chapter, 3 names stand clear. Jonas Kappel, the silent inmate who presses his palms together to count time. Dra. Lucian Voss, the record keeper whose ink, stained fingers chose to preserve a page. And Antoine Marek, the warden whose brass keys and narrow eyes sealed silence as punishment. Each man makes choices that escalate the stakes, Marek with orders, Voss with concealment, Jonas with hidden marks, and the ledger and key alter the balance of control. The final beat is not rhetorical. It is the act of Voss slipping the brass key into his waistcoat pocket and locking the ledger away. The sound of the drawer closing a concrete punctuation to the night's violence. Guards shoved Jonas Kappel into the warden's office as the key ground in the lock. Antoine Marek kept his back straight behind the desk and did not flinch. This is the final protocol, Marek. Jonas felt fear in his limbs. Fear pushed him to keep his hands empty and his jaw clamped. The first 5 sentences set the problem plainly. Marek would use silence as the instrument that decided Jonas' fate. The warden's brass key had already been mentioned in earlier logs. The key's ring had sung across the corridor in Chapter 1 when guards escorted Jonas along wet stone. Now that same key would close a test cell designed to erase names. The narrator frames the scene without explanation. Action arrives, stakes are visible, and the emotional root, fear, drives Jonas to act. Marek tapped the keys on the desk. Dr. Lucian Voss stood to his right with a small leather ledger under his arm and a vial pinned to his lapel. Bring him forward, Marek ordered. A guard stepped into the doorway and pushed Jonas another pace. Jonas pressed his palms together the way he always did when counting time. He had learned to count to survive. Now he cradled those counts like a brittle talisman. Jonas had been moved through the corridor earlier that night, the same corridor where the observation hatch had grated open in Chapter 2. The hatch's sound still lived in his memory, a thin metal rasp and a slice of light that made the cell look smaller. He remembered Merrick's voice through that hatch then. He remembered the ledger that Jar Voss had used to mark responses and times. Those specific items, keys, hatch, ledger, have followed him into this room and into the present danger. Name, Merrick, not looking at him, Jonas Capel. Number 96, Jonas answered in a voice that scraped. The guards closed the door behind him and left it slightly ajar so Merrick could hear everything he did. We will observe the acceleration of muteness tonight, Voss. And lifted the ledger like a surgeon lifting a chart. His voice was precise and detached. Jonas swallowed. He had endured long stretches of silence before. He had counted breath to breath in the cell, measured light along the wall, measured the time between drip and drip. Those actions were habits of survival, but now the test meant more than endurance. Merrick's protocol promised a forced shrinking of speech, a tight curfew of sound until a man was no longer certain of his name. Jonas's fear pushed him to do one concrete thing: keep a scrap of paper hidden. He had slipped it to a young guard 2 nights before, folded small, with a name and a single date on it. Merrick read aloud the terms, not to Jonas but to the ledger. Isolation. No light except a stub. No writing implements. Observation through hatch only. Medical checks at interval. Any vocalization will be met with disciplinary measures. He looked up then, directly at Jonas. Do you understand? Yes, Warden Jonas. The reply was short. His mouth felt dry. When the exchange ended, Merrick pushed the ledger across the desk and signaled the guard. The warden's hand rested on the brass key ring. His finger brushed one key as if confirming weight. The corridor down to the sub-basement smelled of damp mortar and stale oil. Guards moved Jonas like a crate, elbows hooked under his arms. They did not shout. Silence was part of the method. The men adopted flat faces to match it. Down there, under the prison yard, the test cell waited with its iron door and a slit for observation. Voss carried a small satchel of instruments. A candle stub, a gauze pad, a tape to measure chest rise, and the ledger already open to a fresh page. At the cell threshold, Voss paused and checked his spectacles. He ran a finger along the ledger margin and marked the hour. We will intensify with sensory curtailment, he said. We remove stimulation. Light scent. Speech. We note the point of fracture. His words were clinical. Jonas watched Voss' hands instead of his face. Voss' hands had ink stains on the fingertips. They moved like a clerk's, but with the surgeon's steadiness. Jonas felt the second emotion arise, a gut-level doubt about whether any observer could remain purely clinical. The doubt shifted into suspicion of Voss's motives. The test cell door closed with a metallic groan. Guard hands locked the latch. The candle stub was set to one side and wedged into a brass holder beneath the observation slit, just enough light for the hatch to record. Voss wrote in the ledger, subject placed. Baseline recorded. Pulse steady. He pushed the quill back into his pocket. Merrick stood with his arms folded, keys at his side. Jonas held his hands so tightly that the skin on his palms whitened. The silence pressed down. He counted breaths, steady as a metronome. He tried to picture the corridor he had walked that night, the scrape of leather boots on stone, the ring of the brass keys. Memory here means recollection of a sound, a touch, a specific event, not an abstract fog. He catalogued those details because cataloging was proof he still had a mind to hold. Hours passed. Voss recorded times on the ledger with precise strokes. He called through the hatch at set intervals. Pulse. Still here, Jonas mouthed once, without voice. The act of mouthing became a small rebellion, a movement that kept his lips from seizing. He watched the grain of the cell wall and measured the way the candle flame dipped every time a guard passed by the slit. Each guard's footstep became an event to mark in his head. 1 step, pause. 2 steps, slide of key. The third emotion shift arrived when a guard returned the scrap Jonas had slipped him. The guard was young. His face was round and new to cruelty. In a narrow corridor outside the test cell, the guard hesitated and slid a folded paper into Jonas' palm. Jonas felt hope flicker at the edges of his fear. He had not expected salvage. He unfolded the scrap by the light of a distant candle. On it was a single name and a sequence of dates, a list Jonas had meant to hide away. Jonas raised his head. The guard had already moved on. Jonas held the scrap and pocketed it beneath his tunic. That small transfer changed the angle of the room. Someone among the staff had a doubt that showed up as a paper. It was the first indication that Marek's order had cracks. Jonas felt a cautious resolve harden. He would use that scrap. He would force the ledger to speak. Back above, Voss adjusted his spectacles and inspected the test cell through the hatch. He allowed the time and a dry detail. Subject's eyelids flutter at 6 hours 37 minutes. Marek nodded, prepare to seal further. Temper the light and increase observation frequency. Marek's voice did not break. Voss's ledger received those words like ink to bone. Jonas watched them write his life in ordinary strokes while they planned his erasure. Inside the cell, Jonas had a plan. He would not speak. He would not give them the sound. Instead, he kept the scrap's message pressed beneath his shirt and waited for the practical moment to act. He had observed Voss's habit of leaving the ledger near the hatchboard when inspections occurred. He had watched Marek always withdraw a brass key with a thumb and test its fit on the latch. Those mechanical, repeatable actions were his routes to opportunity. At pre-dawn, Voss and Marek opened the hatch for inspection. The candle offered a thin cone of light. Voss leaned over and peered into Jonas's face. He checked the pulse, recorded a note, and then set the ledger on the table adjacent to the hatch for a fuller examination. Jonas watched the ledger's exposed page. The ledger looked like a private book. Voss treated it as a record. That assumption became a leverage point. While Marek stepped to consult with a guard, Jonas reached under his tunic and drew out the scrap. He rasped breath around the tug and pressed the folded paper to the inner side of his wrist until it wetted, and then he used a small puncture from a shard of flint in the floor to produce a thin line of blood. He had done this in the cell when he believed no one looked, an act he would later regret and claim only out of necessity. He wrote a name and dates across Voss's ledger page with his blood when Voss briefly turned away. The letters were crude, but they were readable. A surname, a place, a date pattern that matched other entries in the ledger. When Voss returned, he saw the scrawled crimson immediately. What is this? Voss. His voice tightened for an instant. Blood on the page. Marek, coming up behind him. Jonas breathed shallow and steady. The presence of his handwriting on the ledger transformed a private instrument into evidence. The room shifted not in metaphor, but in concrete terms. An official document now bore a name that tied the test to a past injustice. Marek's face sharpened. Who wrote this? He demanded. Voss opened the ledger with hands that trembled ever so slightly. Jonas, a guard said, pointing. Marek moved like a lever and slammed the hatch. He ordered Jonas out. The warden's hand on the brass key was quick. Take him now. Marek. Voss hesitated. For the first time that night his clinical frame showed a split. He set the ledger down and backed away. He had seen the entry. He had also written in that same ledger details that justified the experiments. To Voss, that ledger represented his work and reputation. The sight of blood and a name made the ledger less a tool and more a testimony. In the corridor a scuffle started. A guard reached for the ledger as if to seize it. Dr. Voss stepped between the man and the book. No, he said quickly. Let me copy this first. Marek barked. You copy it later, Voss. Confiscate it now. Voss's hand hovered over the page. Then he moved with a small, decisive motion, folding his jacket beneath his arm and palming the ledger open. He took out a thin folio from a hidden inner pocket and, with precise shorthand, copied the blood, marked line and several surrounding entries. He wrote the dates exactly as Jonas had left them, and he did so in a hand that matched his own neat script. The argument that followed between Marek and Voss contained rapid exchanges. You stole time, Marek snapped. You will not jeopardize the method. I will not lose record, Voss replied. Records matter, Antoine. Records will speak when you destroy other things. You protect your books and not these walls, Marek shot back. You are a coward hiding in ink, Voss retorted. 4 more lines, sharp and clipped, passed between them before Marek signaled the guards to remove Jonas. Their voices were short. Names appeared in each line so the listener could track who spoke. The rapid back and forth showed a collision of priorities. Marek's control versus Voss's fear of losing a record of the truth. Jonas was dragged past them as Voss slipped the copied folio beneath his coat. Voss's fingers were ink-smudged, and for a moment the ledger lay open like a wound. A guard hit Jonas's shoulder and barked, "Move." No heroics. Jonas kept his gaze on Voss. He saw the doctor tuck the folio, saw the doctor's eyes flick toward a patch of mortar near an outer wall. Voss did not call out. He had made a small, human choice. To save a copy, Marek ordered the ledger sealed into the records office. The ledger would be altered. Men who served the warden's need would cross out, redact, or reword entries. Jonas's blood might be trimmed away with a knife or inked over, yet Voss had made a copy. That act represented a twist. A man who had been clinical enough to catalogue suffering had become the guardian of evidence. The twist changed how the listener understood Voss's earlier notations. He was not purely indifferent. He had limits. During the scuffle, a guard tried to snatch the folio from Voss's coat. Voss shoved the man and ran a hand along a seam. Then he dug his fingers into the mortar of an abandoned outer wall and slipped the folio and a rusted key into a hollow he had noticed months before when inspecting decay. He pressed the mortar back with his palm until dust hid the seam. No one around him saw the precise movement because attention was fixed on Jonas and the ledger being carried away. Jonas felt the world tilt through a sequence of concrete events. A ledger marked in blood, a doctor copying entries with a hidden folio, a rusted key and a niche in mortar. Those items would matter later. The emotional shift for Jonas moved again. Fear dimmed into a cold clarity. He now understood that some men kept records and some men kept power. Both could be used as weapons. Jonas accepted his removal with a new calculation. He would not trust silence alone. He would trust the concrete trail he had left. Outside, dawn thinned the sky. Marek watched the guards remove Jonas. He lifted his pocket watch and noted the hour with a clipped motion. Voss stood nearby with ink on his fingertips and a ledgerless hand. He did not speak. The 2 men exchanged a look that contained decisions. Marek planned to bury any raw material, and Voss planned to preserve a fragment. That exchange was quiet yet decisive. At the outer wall where the mortar sealed the folio, Voss smoothed dust with his sleeve and walked away with measured steps. He had risked his reputation. He had also shown a disparate loyalty to Rickard. Marek moved to the ledger table and struck a match. He had men who would alter entries in the official set, men who would cut, paste, and burn. He did not hesitate. He a clerk to bring ink and the red binder where official notations were kept. "We will render this a disorderly entry, Marek. We will show no pattern." The clerk nodded and set to work. Jonas was taken into a deeper cell that Marek referred to only as the final compartment. There the light was dimmer, the candle stub smaller, and the hatch fitted with a narrower slit. Guards left him there for a prolonged stretch. He kept his hands folded and practiced breathing as if training for a ritual. He held the memory of the ledger's bloodline and Voss's furtive motion like an ember. When one guard returned later, he paused and looked at Jonas differently. "They'll rewrite it," the guard said, naming the ledger. "But there's a man who won't let them, Jonas, who—" The guard touched the brass keys at his belt. "Voss," he said. "Voss." He copied a page. He buried something outside the wall. That small disclosure arrived like a delivered parcel. An item of hope wrapped in doubt. Jonas concentrated on the guard's face and remembered the guard's hesitation as he had passed the scrap days before. The guard who had returned Jonas's paper earlier had not been pure complicity. He had been a fault in the wall. Time passed. The official record in the administration was doctored as Marek intended. Yet that the copied folio remained in mortar. Voss passed by that wall in the weeks after and adjusted stones to ensure the folio was safe. He signed new entries with a hand that wore a different pressure. The ledger entries that remained accessible to Marek's men lost the bloodline. The red mark vanished from the official book. But the memory of the name persisted in that hidden folio and in the scrap Jonas had given the guard. 2 small vessels now carried a truth that the warden could not immediately destroy. Jonas, in the final cell, felt the last emotional turn. After fear and doubt and a brief flare of hope, resignation and a practical resolve settled in. He understood his role. Survive long enough for the copies to surface or for someone else to speak their piece. He did not make grand vows. Instead, he practiced actions, counting the drip of water, tracing the grain of the iron bar with a fingertip until the friction wore the nail. He kept his breaths timed so that if guards returned abruptly, he could appear asleep. Those mechanics were not sentiment, they were decisions. The chapter closes with an enacted choice. Voss, later that morning, would return alone to the niche and press his hand into the mortar. He would slide the rusted key free and run the folio through his fingers one last time. He would then tuck both into his coat and walk to a meeting with a merchant who occasionally acted as a courier for men who wished to conceal records. Marek, in his office, would instruct the clerk to strike entries with a red ink slash. Jonas would be moved again, deeper and quieter. The ledger in the records room would look clean to any surface inspection. The final paragraph ends on a tight, concrete beat. As guards closed Jonas's new cell door, a young guard whispered the single name from the scrap into his palm, Hoffman, March 5th, and Jonas folded the whisper into his memory like a tool, sharp and ready. The act of the whisper was small and audible. It tied the night's events to the hidden folio, to the rusted key, and to Der Voss's secret. The chapter resolves the immediate conflict. The ledger will be altered, Jonas will be taken, but evidence survives in mortar and in the hands of a few. No poetic closure arrives, only actions and a clear, concrete signal that the truth still exists in physical form.